as I was last week, in a new room in the house today. So this is my basement. Right off the bat, I have to apologize for the lighting situation. I had other lights set up, ones that didn't wash out everything that was going on up here. And unfortunately, with running the laser cutter and trying to keep enough heat in the room that I could actually iron things, I managed to flip the breaker twice today because my basement's not actually set up with this kind of electricity. So I had to kill all of the lights except for the overhead fluorescent, which is terrible for video, but I'm doing what I can. So I will try to hold things up to the camera so you can see them as much as possible. Otherwise, you just have to squint. I'm sorry, but we'll see what happens. So hello, today is laser cutting, which I've had a couple of requests for, and we're specifically going to be talking about laser cutting fabric to do fabric applique, which is something that I started playing around with a couple weeks ago because I had a costume that has a whole lot of really geometric applique, and I didn't want to have to, one, cut it all out by hand, and two, try to satin stitch around some of the really, really fine parts of it. So here's one of the designs. These were actually my test pieces. I'm going to bring them closer to the camera so people can see. But as you can see, there are lots of little bits here that are very small, very fine, that would be very difficult to satin stitch. Possible. I've done really tiny satin stitching before, but for the quantity I had and the fact that I was doing it on stretch fabric, I thought it would be nicer if I didn't actually have to satin stitch that. So I got the idea because a lot of people use like a silhouette machine or a Cricut machine that are made for cutting paper, and will use heat transfer vinyl and cut out shapes and applique that onto fabric, which is a common technique. Except I didn't want vinyl specifically because I didn't want that kind of shine and that kind of texture. And I was trying to match other fabrics that I already had in the costume. So doing it on fabric allows me to match my patterns, match my colors, all of those things. And whereas vinyl would be limited to what colors do the rolls of vinyl come in, fabric has a lot more variety with it. Also, by using a synthetic fabric, I thought if I could heat seal the edges, that would keep them from unraveling. If you've ever cut, nylon webbing and burned the end of the match so it all melted into a blob, basically that's what's happening here on a micro level. So I don't have to worry about it unraveling. So all I had to do was make sure that I had a strong enough adhesive to hold it down and seal it. And that is what I ended up doing. It took a lot of experimenting. And the laser cutter, which I have my dual cameras set up, one of them is just on the laser cutter, so you can see it, which it will be in action after I unplug some other stuff. It's going to be a multi-step process with me running the power outlet a lot for the reasons I gave earlier. But with what I'm using is Glowforge Pro, which is a Class 4 laser cutter. It's got about a 20-inch wide bed, so that's the width I'm dealing with. It does have a pass-through slot, so if I want to cut a large thing, I can move it through in stages and pass it through toward the back. I didn't have to do that with fabric because all of my appliques fit within that size. But in order to do my experimenting, I took some fabric that was the same type of fabric I was going to be using in the final costume, but I just had scraps left over from previous costumes, so it's a different color. This one happened to be red. The fabric I'm using for this is Joanne Casa Satin, which is their kind of mid-grade matte satin. It's not super thick, but it is made of polyester, so it melts. And I made up a template, so I had a whole bunch of repeating shapes. In this case, they were little stars, because that's what I could whip up really fast in Photoshop. So again, bringing these closer so they're not washed out by the light. So you can see I have, ooh, that backlights nicely. I have all of these star shapes repeating all the way across the fabric. And in my software for the laser cutter, I set each star shape to have a different cut speed and a different power setting so that I could gauge what would cut best. So I used a piece of, to prevent flashback where it bounces off the steel plate in the bottom and burns the fabric, which would be bad, setting things on fire. I used a sheet of heavyweight cardstock, adhered the fabric down to it, and I have this paper masking tape, which is basically just a super wide, low adhesive masking tape, which I've put down over the front and back to prevent scorch marks on the fabric, because that is a thing that can happen when you're firing lasers at flammable materials. And and I'm being rated by Dirk Gently, apparently. Hello, Laura VAB's channel. So once I had my settings all set up for the stars, I did a test burn to see what cut through the fabric cleanly and without scorch marks, which led me to the settings that would actually work for this project. And then I did a test cut with my actual applique pattern, which I determined needed to be a little thicker because I had to punch through the paper on the back a little bit. So for those of you just joining, thank you for showing up. most complicated part of doing this whole thing is generating the graphics, because for the laser cutter to cut cleanly, you have to be using a vectorized file. So this is an SVG, and so I had to create the graphics, and then I had to convert them into vector and do all the line edits and everything, which took several days to get all of this, because they are fairly intricate and they had to be mathematically precise to fit everything. But once I have those, then I can reuse them as much as I want. So having the template is actually really useful. And what I'm going to be doing today is a larger version of this one. These are obviously for my gloves, and I'm going to be putting it on some long tails that go on the back of the costume. I just realized my screen is dimming automatically, which is not helpful when I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat. So the gloves are stretch fabric. The fabric that I ironed onto it with the adhesive is not stretched. That is one issue with doing this technique that something like the heat transfer vinyl that I mentioned earlier would probably be superior for. But since it's only down the front part of the glove, the rest of the glove still stretches enough to get around my arm. And all of the rest of the appliques on the costume are non-stretch, so I don't have to worry about that being a problem. So I'm going to move these out of the way, and I will start prepping my material. So what I'm doing, and again, I'm sorry for the washout lights, but I don't want to flip the breaker again while I'm actually trying to live stream. I have a sheet of poster board. This is just cheap paper poster board. That's going to be what I adhere the fabric down to. And then I have my cut piece of satin that I'm going to be using to cut the shapes out of on the laser cutter. And I need to put my adhesive on the back first so that it cuts through the adhesive as well. And I'm going to mask this as well so I don't have to deal with any scorching. And pardon me while I plug in the iron, which again, I can only plug in one thing at any given time without flipping a breaker, so I'm going to try to avoid that. The adhesive I'm using, because it's so important not to have peeling or detaching of the fabric, I'm using Heat and Bond Ultra Hold, which is the toughest iron-on adhesive you can easily find at a fabric store. And I actually got smart. I just bought a wholesale quantity of this. So I have a giant box upstairs that is just a massive roll of 150 yards or something of Heat and Bond. So I figure I'll use it. I've got a costume coming up that has a lot of applique. But this is just a small craft-size sheet that you can buy at Joann locally. And I need to make sure that I have enough to cover this. So I'm adhering the Heat and Bond on the back of the design, or on the back of the fabric out of which the design is going to be cut. And my design is not as wide as the fabric, so I don't need the adhesive to be all the way to the edges. And while my iron heats up, I'm going to smooth this out. I don't like buying the little folded packs because it puts creases in the Heat and Bond, and I'm always worried it's going to transfer to the fabric. Sound is staticky. Hang on. My stream and sound problems, I tell you. So I did, in order to get the two-camera technique, I did have to redo all of my settings. Let me try this again. Oh, it's better now. Okay, yay! I suspect what happened is the fact that it had two camera inputs, it was something in the software was trying to pull audio from both of them. But I just turned off one of them, so it should be fine. Yay, sorted. Okay, good. So hi, everybody. Do I need to repeat anything that I did in, like, since you got here? Was there anything that didn't come through at all? Because I don't know how bad the sound was. It sounds fine to my end, but I've got my side tone turned on. But if you missed the intro where I was talking about what I was doing, feel free to yell at me in the chat, and I will redo that section. What I'm doing now is just putting the adhesive on the back, which I demonstrated a few weeks ago in my my applique demo. It's the exact same technique, because all I'm doing differently is I'm using a laser cutter to cut the fabric instead of scissors. Okay, I was just talking into a fan randomly. I don't know why. I'm using my phone as the second camera, using an IP camera app, and I have no idea how that actually translates into the Twitch stream, because it's the first time I've done it with Twitch. I've done it with Zoom and Discord before, but never with Twitch, so things may handle a little bit differently. So I've got heat and bond going most of the way across the fabric, which should be plenty for the quantity of applique I'm cutting. And I'm doing this all on top of the poster board in the hopes that it actually shows up, which it kind of does in the shadow. I really wish I could use the other lights, but when I plugged them in, it flipped a breaker, so we can't use the other lights. It's going to be like that. Okay, so that seems to be, well, it's slightly wrinkled, but we'll hope that the small cuts don't matter. Now I'm going to unplug the iron so I don't overload the circuit and let that cool down a bit. So the next step is I want to put the masking on top so that I don't have scorch marks. And I'm going to do this in 2 layers because I have 6-inch wide masking, and this is the same masking I use for masking wood and other things for my laser cutting. You know, if I'm buying fancy laser cut materials, they actually come pre-masked, which is really nice because then I don't have to do this. But the fabric, oddly enough, does not come prepared for laser cutting. So this is just like a low-tack masking tape. It's actually the type of stuff, if you've ever bought one of those vinyl decals that are die cut or mechanically cut in a shape, and then they have the application masking over the top, it's just like that. Did I miss if you explained more about masking? I basically talked about what it was for, which was when I'm cutting fabric that is flammable with a laser, I don't want the fabric to get scorch marks on it, which can happen if there's any what's called flashback, which is where it hits the metal pan and bounces back. It can scorch the underside of the fabric, or if there's, you know, since the exhaust fan on this is extremely powerful, it can pull the flame, if a thread catches fire, it can pull the flame across the fabric and leave a black mark. So we're trying to prevent that just by covering up the fabric with some paper. And the laser will go right through the paper with no problem, because it is in fact a laser. And this is not even as tacky as like painter's tape. It's a very, very low tack tape. Yes, we do not want the flammable thing to inflame. That is definitely true, and I have a fire extinguisher immediately next to the laser cutter because I do cut flammable things with it all the time, which is kind of, you know, the point of a laser cutter. So things the laser cutter will work on: wood, plastic, fabric, paper, cardboard, pretty much anything that will burn at any level. And you can surface engrave on metal, but it will not cut metal. So metal, typically you'll have a coating on the metal that'll say turn black. If you've ever seen lasered signs or door plates or something, the coating on the metal is what turns black. The metal itself does not cut because it doesn't burn. You can also do ceramic tile. So I'll do tiles and I will burn the glaze off the tile and then put dye in it. So you have a recessed image in your tile. And so I use my laser cutter to make, you know, magnets and coasters and jewelry and all kinds of things. I do a lot of acrylic. The thing you do not want to put in it is anything made of vinyl or PVC, because if you cut vinyl or PVC with a laser cutter, it kind of releases chlorine gas, which destroys a whole bunch of stuff, including your lungs and your eyes. So that's bad. Fire bad, yes. Okay, so I've got my fabric with the masking over it. And, oh yes, leather. I have done, in fact, I just did leather last week, and I've got another project coming up that I did leather for. And actually, I have a demo. If anybody was here last week when I did the resin casting, I have finished that piece, or at least mostly finished it. I had to recast most of the orange gems because, as I posted on my social media, I discovered after I'd cast them that while the smaller gems were all the same diameter, they were different depths. So I ended up with multiple sizes of orange gems. But this I actually cut the back out of. I'm going to bring it up so it's not in the glare. You might be able to see the engraving on it. So it's got, the entire thing is cut out of, this is Warbler's Black Art, which is a black thermoplastic with the laser. And then it's got the engraving with these lines running between all the gems, and then a sort of a depressed area around each gem that looks like the gems are set down in a bezel. So this was done on just today with the laser. And since it's all circles, it was pretty fast to generate in Photoshop. So I just did that right before I came down to set up for this. Oh, put it over the laser thing. That's probably a better idea because there actually are lights over here. So where's my phone? Phone. Somewhere here? That might be better. Maybe I can get it closer. Will it focus? Hopefully that's showing up. Um, and for those of you who came in late, this horrible fluorescent right over my head is because the other lights down here, if I plug in more than one thing at a time, it trips the breaker and then the laser cutter doesn't work at all. So this is why I'm having to cope with this, which is right here, of course. So now that I have the masking done on the fabric, the next step is to adhere the fabric to my base paper. And this is because I want a solid layer to keep the fabric down all in one level so it doesn't curl up at all. And also so that it has something between the fabric and the metal grid underneath. So what I'm using is this Aerosol basting adhesive. This is stuff that's made for quilters and people. It looks like this. Hey, look, a camera. And this is, you can pick this up at any fabric store for the most part. And it's just a starchy glue spray that you spray on, stick the fabric down, and then it washes out. So we're going to shake this up a bit. And I'm going to get tacky stuff all over my carpet, which I don't really care because it's the basement carpet anyway, and it's probably just going to get flooded out next time we have a good rainstorm because that happens because it's a basement in Indiana. My basement has flooded numerous times. This is not the first carpet I've had down here. Okay, so put this down and smooth it out to the edges. And I want to get all the air bubbles or anything out so that all the fabric is smooth and flat. Does it make a lot of fumes? It depends on what you're cutting or what you're using, unless you're talking about the aerosol, in which case it's the same kind of fumes any like hairspray would have. It's basically just starch mostly, so it's not very fumey. The laser cutter does make fumes depending on what you're cutting. The reason we don't cut vinyl is because it makes chlorine gas, but anything you cut will have a certain amount of residual smoke. If you're cutting plastics or any sort of synthetic materials or foam, you'll get some fumes off of that. The Warbler definitely had some fumes because I could smell it. And so this is not something you want in a room with your birds. If you have pet birds, do not put this anywhere near them. In fact, I was hearing a horror story recently, somebody on the Glowforge forums who had a friend of a friend who was working with some materials and had her birds get very ill, which was bad. So yeah, there are some fumes. I do have a, I don't know, does it show? Maybe. This is a 4-inch duct tubing that goes up and out a window. The Glowforge has a 4-inch port that's meant to go through a dryer vent. I don't have a dryer vent, so I just literally knocked a hole in the middle of the brick window I had, the glass block window I had, and ran it out that way and then sealed over it. It's not the recommended version, but it's what I had available because I didn't have a dryer vent in the basement. So it does exhaust straight outside. And then I've got 2 baffles to keep the cold air from coming back in because the laser cutting is actually affected by ambient temperature. So if I just have that hooked up and I don't have something to block the cold air from coming in, my cuts won't work as well because it's combustion. You know, you're dealing with a certain amount of thermal exchange, and it can affect how your engraving comes out, for example. Not so much the cutting, because the cutting is typically a more powerful laser cut, but if you're just etching something in, then it can be a problem. Does it take longer to etch deeper, like multiple passes, or does it use more laser juice at once? Both. So if you want, and the Glowforge is very versatile as far as I can control how many lines per inch, how many passes, how much power, what speed the laser is moving at, and all of that is adjustable. So laser juice. So funny story on the laser juice. Back when the Glowforge was new on the community, they had a slightly different power system than they have now, and the community as a whole decided that the name of the numbering system for how much laser power to apply was pews. So you could have 380 pews, pew pew pew. So that was the sound the laser made, of course, in the fan community. But yeah, so I can set it to full power with a single pass. I can set it to partial power with 1 pass, but very close together lines. I can set it for 3 passes if I want to do a very low power so I don't risk setting something on fire. It just depends on what you're doing with it, but that's all adjustable. It's all very, very versatile. More pew pew. Yeah, I haven't seen people using the pews a lot, and I think it's because when they issued new firmware for the printers, and so it's a slightly different system now, but I think the old school people still think of them as pews because, it's fun. Okay, so I now have my poster board, hot pink. I have my adhesive, I have my fabric, and then I have the masking over it. I am now going to turn on, wait a minute, everything's unplugged over here, right? Yes, everything's unplugged over there. I'm now going to turn on the Glowforge, and it's going to take a second to warm up. And you'll see the head moving. Every time you turn it on, it recalibrates, so it has to go through its calibration cycle, and the head's going to move around and focus the camera and everything. It has an onboard camera, which is really convenient because then you can actually get a live heads up on your software of what's going on in your bed. New firmware does not measure in pews, and that is a missed marketing. Yeah, you know, they really should have marketed it as pews. I think that would have been a good idea. So once that gets run through its cycle, then I'm going to stick this in and magnet it down. I have some very strong, these are ceramic magnets, but they're small and powerful ones. And these are what's going to hold everything flat to the bed so that it can't curl up at the ends. So this paper, I mean, you can probably see, I think that's enough shadow. The ends sort of curl up naturally because it's paper and it's tape and it doesn't actually sit flat. And the way the laser works is it has sort of an hourglassy beam shape. It has mirrors that focus the beam and angle it exactly at the surface of the material that you're cutting. And this has about a 2-inch range, so I can cut something that's super, super thin, like a sheet of paper, or I can cut something like an inch thick board. But how you set the laser to hit the surface affects how it actually cuts. So if I've got one end of the paper curling up, the laser's not going to be focused at that level, so I need to make sure everything stays totally, totally flat. So we're almost done. It has to calibrate, it has to focus. I'm going to use this opportunity to get a drink. If you have any additional questions or comments, feel free to throw stuff in the chat, because I am watching the chat. I got smart. There's a TV in my basement, and I ran my computer output into the TV so I can actually see it at a far enough distance that I can read the chat. Because I had to plug in the computer on the far side of the room, because if I plugged it in on this side of the room, it tripped the breaker. Normally I have my computer upstairs and I run everything over the web. Someone skilled in the Internet of Things could connect laser software activity to audio. Possibly, very possibly. Certainly you could put a little, additional piece on the app that controls the whole thing. All right, that seems to be done. So now we put this in, and magnets everywhere. So this sort of honeycomb-shaped grid along the bottom, if you see this is a metal grid, and it is magnetic, or it's steel rather, so the magnets stick to it, which comes in really handy if you need to hold stuff down. And I'm using magnets that are very flat, so I don't have to worry about the laser head hitting them, because that would be bad. You do not want to damage the laser head. Oh, I may not have enough magnets to do the spacing I'm currently on, so let me steal one of these. Okay, so that is all flat. I'm going to close that. The lights come back on. Reminds me of the bottom of a toaster oven. Yeah. This is the Glowforge Pro bridger, which is... so this is actually my third Glowforge Pro. So way back when Glowforge first launched, I was part of the Kickstarter, which meant that, they didn't actually have the units made yet. They were still sorting things out, but I pre-ordered one. This is going back 6 or 7 years, and 3.5 years after I actually put the money down for it, one showed up. It had a problem, so that one got sent back, and they sent me another one. It had a problem, so that one got sent back. They sent me this one. So this is my third Glowforge Pro. But this one, so far, mostly seems to work. And I've had this for about, I don't know, 1.5, 2 years, something like that. And what makes it the Pro is it's a little larger, has a little more power capability, so you can have more speed settings and more pews. And also it has a pass-through slot, which is this slot in front down here actually opens up, which means if I want to cut something that's, say, 40 inches long that won't fit in the bed, I can turn it 90 degrees and feed it through and do the laser cutting in stages, which is something it's what makes it a Class 4 laser, because it means the laser could theoretically escape the unit, which is why I have these nice laser-proof protective glasses that if I'm using the pass-through slot have to be worn, and I have to have a sign at the stairs to my basement that says "Caution, Class 4 laser in operation." Technically, it's a private residence. I probably am not required by law to have that, but if you had one in a workshop or anything like that, you would be. I have it up anyway just because it's fun to have a laser sign. But yeah, so the Pro is a little bit bigger and a little bit more powerful, and I got it specifically so I could do the pass-through, so I can do things like cutting props with it, since cosplay requires me to cut large objects, and when I was doing things like the Dirk Gently scissors swords that I talked about a couple weeks ago, it would have been really nice to be able to just chuck those in a laser cutter and have it cut all the 6 layers of wood for me, as opposed to doing them all individually by hand with the jigsaw, which is what I did. So yeah, I've not done a lot with the pass-through because the software was not available when the machine first shipped. They were still updating things, but I have some plans for that very soon. In fact, one of the costumes I'm working on right now is going to require it, I think. So I'll put this back over here. Okay, so this looks like it's all set up and ready to go. So let me tab on over to my software. So because the Glowforge, everything runs on the internet. Basically, it's cloud-based, so you're setting up your... Hang on, let me get this aligned. You're setting up your files on the Glowforge app on their website, and then it runs through their remote servers and feeds the cutting instructions to your machine over the internet. So you do have to have a live Wi-Fi signal. Okay, that should be ready to go. I believe I have that aligned exactly so the seam is between the 2 layers, but let me double check that. It's not the end of the world if not, because it's just for the tape. And what I'm doing now is focusing, so you're going to see the arm moving a bit. I'm focusing the height of the material, which you can enter manually if you know, I have a pair of calipers and I could measure it, but it's easier just to hit the focus button and let it figure out how tall that is so it can self-focus. Okay, that's good. Now I'm hitting print. Okay, so Bridger is asking about the parts of the machine. The bar part in the middle, so there's this part right here. This is the cable for the camera. So the camera is actually right here where my finger is. And that gives you the live view of what's going on in your bed. It doesn't actually show you the cutting process, but it shows you the setup. So if you put your material in, that way you can align things appropriately and put your patterns where they need to be. So this is just the cord running over to the camera. The camera's right here. This part is the moving arm. And it's kind of like the world's biggest, most sensitive, and most devastating Etch-a-Sketch. So, you know, it moves up and down, and it moves left and right. And the combination of the up, down, and left and right gearing is what allows it to move all the way around the bed. So I believe... are you blinking yet? Yes, you are blinking. Okay, this means it's ready to go, so I am now going to hit start. And you may hear some fans because the exhaust starts. So now it is cutting the shapes. Nothing's on fire yet. That's a good sign. First person view. Yeah, the reason it's so fast, Laura, is because this is a single pass cut, so it's not having to cut through really thick layers, and I have the power and speed balance. So it's actually cutting at 500 speed. It goes up to 1,000. No. It goes up to... I'd have to check what it is for non-proof grade materials. They changed, because they changed the scale back when they changed the power settings. But it is cutting fairly quickly, and then I can control the power specifically for each material as well. But you could have it cut slower. And I don't know, I'm not sure if it's showing, you might be able to see at the top, but there is a decent amount of smoke coming off of this, and it's all blowing back toward the vent. So if you watch the darker areas of the bed, you might see some smoke billowing out of it. And yeah, Grace, you probably are seeing little flashes of light. That'll be where the laser is hitting the metal underneath and bouncing back. And that's why I have the board under it, because the If the laser hits the metal and bounces back immediately into your material, it can actually burn the underside of your material, which with something as thin as fabric is not ideal. It can happen a lot with acrylic too. I do a lot of acrylic cutting for jewelry making. And frequently, if I'm cutting a small piece of acrylic, I'll put a sheet of paper underneath it to prevent the oxygen from pulling, like you don't want it catching fire, basically. So if you can stop the airflow, it'll keep it from having a little flash fire and burning the acrylic. We're almost done. There we go. And the exhaust fan's going to run for a few seconds longer to continue to pull the smoke out so you don't end up with a cloud of smoke and blowing into your house, which is good. So now, take all the magnets off. Did you cut all the way through? I really hope you cut all the way through. I can't actually tell if you cut all the way through. Let me double check that. Yeah, it looks like it. It's hard to tell because the adhesive that is holding the fabric down to the poster board is actually stronger than the masking adhesive, which sometimes makes it hard to tell if it's cut all the way through. And I keep some masking tape down here so I can, on pieces like wood, I can just stick it and lift it out to make sure it's cut. Okay, so we now have, this is what it looks like. If that'll focus there. We now have the complete designs cut out. So the thing I have not, yeah, Laura, if it's not cut completely through and I haven't moved it at all, I can run it again, but I usually have to run it on a lower power so I don't overcut. And in fact, I did that with the piece I showed earlier. Where did I put the Blastia? I'm sure I set it down somewhere. The little piece of Orbla that I showed earlier, I did the engraving on it, and the engraving wasn't quite as deep as I wanted. Oh, it's right here by my iron. Haha. It was just behind the iron. So I actually reran the whole design again to double the thickness, or double the depth at which it was engraving. Yes, thank you. I found it. We're good. So what I have not figured out how to do yet is how exactly to lift the applique off in one piece and put it down in one piece like you do with vinyl decals. Because as I mentioned, the adhesive that is holding the fabric down is stronger than the adhesive that is on the masking. So all of my attempts to mask and lift off have not worked really well. So I'm just going to peel this masking off so I don't have to deal with it, because otherwise it'll get all over my fabric and that's annoying. So I'm currently looking at 4 layers of thing here. The top layer is the masking. Then I've got the fabric. Then I've got the paper backing that was on the heat and bond, which is actually what is stuck to the poster board. And then I've got the poster board itself. The way I have the laser set, it did not cut all the way through the poster board. That was by design because I didn't want to have to deal with layers and layers and layers of peeling. So now I get to take off all of the various layers of paper. Now, it is not the end of the world if I leave this masking on until I iron the fabric on, because the masking, the iron's not going to affect it really. It's paper and the adhesive is not really thermal. So if I run the iron over the masking paper, I can just peel it off afterwards. It's not like it's going to melt onto the fabric. Because since I'm working with polyester, it has a low enough ironing temperature. It's not like I'm working with cotton or silk. So I'm not going to do anything that is hot enough to scorch the paper. The transfer tape for vinyl is what this is, basically. So in theory, like that's what I was hoping, and I actually tried putting additional pieces of uncut transfer tape over it. But because the adhesive is designed to separate relatively cleanly when you use it to do things like apply vinyl, it comes off too easily. And the basting spray, probably if I used a slightly less sticky basting spray, I could have a little more luck with it. But so far, no joy. So this is the basting spray that I have. It's what I could get. We'll see if I have something else that'll work better later. All right, so let me get rid of this. And now I'm going to try to peel this off of the backing. So this design's a little fun because it's got these long figure 80 type bits that come off in one long squiggle that I then get to rearrange on the fabric. So I'm actually going to do this in a couple of stages here. So let me lay out my piece that I'm actually going to be ironing onto. And because this is heat and bond, it's easy to see the shiny side goes down. And this is the bottom. So I'm going to kind of recreate this as I go. And if I could come up with a good way to transfer, then I would just be able to lift it off and apply it exactly where it needs to be. But at least this design is not hopelessly complex. The big thing is just making sure that all the geometric shapes are the same distance from each other, because these little gaps have to be even. But since the fabric wants to lie flat, that makes it easier to arrange that. And the beautiful thing about the laser cutter and the polyester is the edges. I can feel when I'm handling this, there's a very, very slight burr at the edge, which is where the fabric fibers have melted together, which means this is not going to unravel. I could run this through the washing machine and it'll stay with the edges sealed, just like if you melt the edge of a nylon belt or web or dog collar or something. I always think of it in terms of horse tack because we used to burn holes through the ends of halters and things when I was a kid. All right, so that should be positioned correctly. Make sure it's straight. It seems to be fairly straight. So what I'm going to do, because this is kind of finicky and wants to bounce around a little bit, I'm actually going to iron on one part of it and then add each piece separately. So while my iron is heating up, just going to make sure this is all in one spot. Stay. Because I'm doing this on a piece that's already been, it would be a lot easier if I did this on fabric that wasn't already sewn into a shape, but since I'm modifying something that already existed that I'm not going to use again, this is already gathered at this end, so there are a bunch of wrinkles that want to keep pulling off to the side. So it's going to be fun to try to keep all that straight. But I'll just keep my hand there while I iron it, so it can't move. I can hear my iron popping as it heats up because my basement's really cold, actually. I had the heater running until it tripped the breaker. Story of today. Breaker trips over and over and over. Which I would dearly love to have the Glowforge someplace where it wasn't pulling too much power, but my house is not really, I mean, my house was built in the 40s and grounded outlets are a rarity. Like I have one grounded outlet here. I have one grounded outlet in my bedroom. There's some in the living room, but a lot of the outlets, like these over here, are still just two-prong outlets because they're original outlets from when the house was built. So obviously, something that's pulling as much power as the Glowforge definitely requires a grounded outlet. No, let go. All right, there we go. This should be hot by now. Yes. So I'm just going to start in the middle and press this down and let it melt enough to hold in place while I iron the rest of it. There we go. And the tricky part about this design is it has all these little pokey bits that stick out to the side, and all of those have to be sealed down completely, because if they start peeling, it could pull the rest of the piece up. But you also don't want to over iron it and burn anything, because polyester melts. Which, at least polyester is one of the higher temperature synthetics compared to other synthetics, but still. Alright, we're going to let that cool for just a second before I move it. Oh, it's nice. I'm going to put my cold hands on this. Okay. So now I'm going to grab the next piece. And this one, the backing came off with it, so I'll just split that off. At least the paper backing does come off the heat and bond very easily, which makes this convenient. That looks pretty good. And then I've got the top little part. Oh, okay, so this one took the poster board with it. That part of the poster board did get cut all the way through. Which is better than the opposite problem, because it's easier to take the poster board off after it gets cut than it is to recut the fabric if it doesn't come all the way off. The heat bond has just enough tack to keep it from sliding easily over the fabric. It doesn't really stick, but if you need to position something and not have it migrate, it pretty much holds its spot once you push it down. And while I'm doing this exciting positioning pieces of fabric, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Or, you know, if you want to provide sports commentary for me putting down little pieces to iron. I know you said earlier you can control the number of lines per inch. Is that effectively the same as being able to control the laser width, or more like the resolution of the image, how clean the circles are, how pixelated the cut is? It's much more like the DPI of printing. So if I want something that looks really clean and doesn't have any texture to it, I'm going to set it to, say, 400 lines per inch, so it's completely smooth and clean. If I cut it at I think the lowest graphic setting you can go that's built into the Glowforge, obviously you can customize anything, but I think it goes down to like 150 lines per inch, and then there's actually some visible scoring because it's how quickly the laser, or how far apart the laser beams are. And the beam actually does have a width. It's not it's the width of the laser beam is how you determine your kerf, which kerf is a fancy name for the part that gets burned out when you're cutting something. So since the beam does take up some width, if you don't have the lines per inch set really low, you can actually see where the lines go back and forth a bit. Which if you're just doing like a mock-up for something, if you can see behind me on this shelf, I've got stacks of different kinds of wood, and one of the stacks is draft board, which is just a really cheap material that you can use to make mock-ups if you're trying to make a three-dimensional object and you don't want to waste your really good expensive wood, because some of these woods are quite pricey. Draft board is like $4 a sheet, so if you ruin a sheet, oh well. So if you're doing something like, I just want to see how my graphics lay out on this object, you don't have to set your DPI really, or your lines per eye, your LPI, lines per inch, LPI. If you set them really wide, then it goes a lot faster because the Glowforge doesn't have to make as many passes, and you could cut your printing time down by 75%. But if you're doing something and you want it to be really finished and have really high resolution, then you would set it for a higher LPI. So it's very, very much analogous to images or printing, like computer printing. All right, I've just got these last little pokey bits, and then this one will be done. And then I will show you all what it looks like finished. These little guys always make me second guess my placement because they're all supposed to be at the same angle. This is why I really need to come up with a way to transfer. Maybe I can just find a stronger adhesive that I can put over everything, but whatever it is has to not be heat reactive because since I have to iron over it. Transfer tape would be great, except the transfer tape is how we got here. And it came off. Last piece. And I look at this and then I think back to things like my Zelda tabard that took like 3 days of satin stitching to get all of those pieces tacked down in the right spot. I'm like, you know, this would actually be a lot more convenient. Alright, there's one random thread. One thread that did not cut cleanly. Let me trim that off. There we go. Alright, are all of you... You are all stuck down except for that tip. Stick. Okay, everything else looks good. Alright, so this is the first one. It looks like that. Does that show fairly well? I think so. Why is there a random green line across my screen? I'm really hoping that's on my end. Is anybody else seeing a green line across the middle of this camera feed? Because I'm not sure why that's there. Maybe it's just me. Anyway, so this is the end result. You can see how long it took. It was a lot faster than doing it by hand, and it is very well adhered. So as I said, I could run this through the washing machine, and it would stay on. Which I shouldn't have to run this through the washing machine, but if I wanted to. Okay, the green line must just be on my display. I don't know why that is. But I'm not using the world's best TV either. In fact, I got this TV free, so. Which, for the price I paid, is a great TV. But it might just have some graphic issues. Alright, so other side here. Once I have the graphics generated, if I need to mirror anything, like flip them laterally to make them, you know, mirror down both sides of my body or something like that, it's very easy to do that. And I can just upload 2 sets of images for my cutting. Okay, now I've got this same thing on the other side. Was the ooh in reaction to something in particular, Laura, or was that just the mirroring? Or was that a reaction to... I'm not sure what the lag is between my talking and you guys seeing it, so that might have been a reaction to what it looked like. Clearly the TV didn't heed the warning glass for laser and use sign. You're not wrong. Doubt the TV took much care. TV is definitely not wearing protective goggles. Whee! My giant Slinky-O material. Oh, you know what? I should have measured that. How far is this from the end? That is... okay, that's where it is. Totally by accident, I managed to make it perfectly even with one corner. Lag is pretty short, about 15 to 30 seconds. Yeah, Laura, your stream was having lag too, so it might just be your connection is really slow because that cable was down. I'm in Indiana where we had a truckload of snow because we had big snowstorms all over the Midwest, and it took down some of the cable. So things are a little bit slower than usual, um, but it's not the end of the world. We have survived slow cable before, and we shall again. So no, I don't have to satin stitch the edges, Grace, which is which is only the case because I'm using a synthetic that melts. If I were doing something like cotton, then I would still have to because cotton does not melt, cotton burns, and assuming I could get the cotton to cut cleanly without catching fire, which would be another experiment to run, then the edges would not be perfectly sealed because they wouldn't have melted. So I would still need to satin stitch those, which if it's a complex enough design that I didn't want to cut it out with scissors, it might still be worth laser cutting it just so I didn't have to cut it out with scissors. But I would still have to satin stitch the cotton. But this is going to be really useful for things, especially things like nylon that melt really fast. Polyester can still burn, it just doesn't burn very well. But something like nylon that melts immediately on contact with heat would be great for this. But the fabric that I was using for this particular costume happened to be polyester. So that's what we're going with. Now, if I wanted it to be technically correct and look technically correct, could I still satin stitch it? Yes, absolutely I could. Am I going to satin stitch this one? No. This is not a competition costume. As long as it's structurally sound, I don't care. Also, I really don't want to mess with satin stitching these tiny, tiny little curves because it's just tedious. It's not fun to satin stitch things that are like literally 3 millimeters wide. It's possible. It's not entertaining. Okay. Now, because I need to make sure that this goes all the way to the end, I'm going to go ahead and put this piece on. Since the first one, I didn't have to match the distance, this one I actually do. All right, let me check this against the other side real quick. Make sure it looks okay. Don't move, don't move. Yeah, it's close enough. See above, not a competition costume. Also, if somebody is like grabbing the bow that's hanging off of my backside to check my distance by the millimeter, then I'm going to be punching them anyway, and they won't actually get to see. Would a nylon applique need satin stitching if cut by hand? Yes. If you were not burning it, which there are things you can do if you're doing like if you're making a piece that has a chiffon overlay or organza or something, and it's a meltable material, you can use things like a soldering iron and just go along the edge and melt it if you're very, very careful. But if you just cut it with scissors and it's not being melted, then yes, it will still need satin stitching or something to stabilize it. Otherwise, the threads that make up the weave of the fabric will start fraying, and obviously that's not ideal, and it's not going to help the durability of that piece. But if it's melted, it becomes a glob of plastic, and globs of plastic, unlike threads, can't really unravel. And this one, I can actually see a color change. I'll try to show it when I get it over to the camera again. I'll try to show where the color change is, where I can see where it's melted. I'm not sure if it'll show up really well on, just because the resolution of that camera is not that high, because it's just the free IP Cam app that's running on my phone. But this camera does have a high enough resolution, but this camera is in the dark, so I'm not sure it would show up. So I'll show it in a second and see what happens as soon as I get these last little bits on. I've got 6 of the little diamonds to add. Oh wait, nope, I've got 6 diamonds and 1 triangle to add, and then this one will be done. Is a hot knife good for that, or are they more for foam? Anything that gets hot enough to melt it will work. The trick is doing it consistently along the edge. So if I've got, whether it's a hot blade or a soldering iron or a cigarette lighter, whatever you're using, I have to move it along. If this is my fabric, I need to move my hot object across the edge of the fabric at a consistent speed and consistent distance to melt it uniformly along the edge. This is why the laser is giving a really clean cut, because the laser doesn't vary in power or distance. It's always going to be the same. If I'm doing it by hand with a candle or a match, matches and flames and things will actually blow back and forth with air currents, and so you won't usually get a really consistent clean edge. If you're using something like a excuse me, like a hot knife, and you have your fabric tacked down really carefully, either using something like the spray adhesive or using pinned down to a solid surface like on a pinning or cutting table, you can get a really clean edge with a hot knife or a soldering iron. You just have to be careful about how you move it along the fabric, because you want a consistent cut, or I mean a consistent melt, so it doesn't change the shape of your applique, especially if you're doing something with little fine details like these pointy bits. If you move your knife too close to the fabric in one spot, it could actually eat into the edge and take a chunk out of your shape, and that's not really what you want. Now we get the little diamond bits, shiny side down. Sorry, I missed a couple things in the chat. Yes, Laura, these are butt bows. They are fuku bows. This, once upon a time, this was a Sailor Pluto butt bow. It is no longer a Sailor Pluto butt bow, but it is still going to be on the back of fuku. So this is just the bottom part of the bow. These are the tails. The top part of the bow I can show in a minute when I'm not sticking things to myself. Give me just a second. Nah. Stay put. Little diamond pieces take 4 times as long as anything else because they're so finicky. They don't want to stay in place. Anyway, the fact that these are butt bows means this will be hanging directly over my backside, and if somebody is grabbing my butt bow to look at my placement, that's why I was saying I would punch them and they wouldn't actually get to see how close they were. People should not be going around grabbing other people's costumes, especially not in those locations. What did you learn about today? Burning butt bows with lasers. Nothing if not educational. We strived for excellence here in cosplay live streams. All right, last ones. Almost done. If I can get this paper off. All right, last one. Okay. So, the top half of the bow is right here. And the butt bow tails, which is what these are, go through the back of the loop of the top half of the bow and fall out immediately. Come on, get through there. satin is slippery. And you end up with a bow with applique tails that goes on your butt, or just above, actually. So that's the end goal there. Let me see if I can show the color change on here. Okay, so you can kind of see him. Let's see. I don't know how well this is going to show. Right along the edge of these little narrow pieces, where the laser kind of slowed down to make that sharp turn, you can see that it's a tiny bit darker right there at the edge. And that is the melted section. Let me move it around, see if that shows up any better. That's the edge where it's just a tiny bit darker is where the fibers have melted together, which means that they're sealed and I don't have to worry about them unraveling. You know, it's applique that's not stitched on, so I'd still want to be careful of it to make sure I didn't overwhelm the adhesive, which, oops, I just found a spot that was not ironed down all the way. Which can happen, which is why you still want to baby it a little bit. So I wouldn't want to be really super rough with it. But for casual wear, especially for something that's not structural, it's just a decorative surface on a part of the costume that's not going to be under any strain, this works really well. All right, I have no idea what that sticker is that you just posted. Is that a something eating a heart? Is that a dog? Sorry, Laura, your icons are confusing to me. They aren't showing up very well in my chat. Okay. So there we have it. We have witnessed the full laser cutting experience. I mean, not including the 3 days it took me to generate those graphics so I could cut it. But from the fabric preparation to the applique process, this is the end product here. And that took a whole lot less time to put together than it would have if I had to cut these out by hand, because snipping out all these little tiny curves and getting them all accurate would be super annoying. So this is, considering I have these on both bows, the collar, and both gloves, this was a lot faster once I had those graphics generated. And again, here are the gloves that go with them. So, any other questions? The dog brought you a heart, but because the butt bow pewed pretty. Okay. Gotcha. I needed some interpretation on that. Any other questions or commentary, or, you know, dogs bringing dubious body parts? I shouldn't say that. Laura has a lot of acreage. Her dogs might have shown up with dubious body parts. I mean, I've had dogs show up with things like part of deers and you know, dead creatures that they've found and brought back for souvenirs, but wow, I timed that really well because it's just after 9. I wasn't sure how long this would actually take. So, okay, I have no idea what I'm talking about next week, because I'm in the middle of a whole bunch of things. I'm really hoping the materials show up so I can be working on my cool light up sword that is another current prop project I'm working on. If that doesn't work, then I have a lot of sewing to do. And failing that, I have about 4 wigs I need to be styling. So I know we've talked about the wig ventilating streams in the past, and you know, the fact that watching me ventilate wigs would probably be very boring, but maybe I can get somebody to talk in a joint stream with me and we can discuss stuff. But here's the resin came out well from last week, so I don't have to redo that for another stream, so that's good. I do still have to do the attachment to get this to stick to my shirt, but that's easy. And I guess if there are no burning questions, burning, pun not intended. I mean, we didn't actually set fire to anything, so that's good. But then I think we're good for the week. I'm going to go ahead and unplug. I was supposed to have human remains on my property tonight, but the weather canceled it. Yeah, the human remains under the 10 inches of snow might have been, I mean, the dogs could still smell it, but the handlers wouldn't want to be out there hiding the remains, I wouldn't think. Although you never know. You know, they could find somebody who got stranded way off the road in your cornfields. All right, so I'll be back next Tuesday with some topic or other. If you have a topic you want to see, feel free to send it to me and let me know. Otherwise, we'll have surprise topic next Tuesday, because I don't know how far along I'll be on all of my various things I'm working on. But thanks for joining, and now you've seen laser cutting, and feel free to hit me up with other laser cutting questions if you have any, because I actually run a business doing this, so I do it a lot, and I sell stuff that I make. So let me know if anything strikes your fancy. And I will see all of you, or whoever chooses to show up, next Tuesday. Thanks for hanging out, and I bid you a good evening. And I will have to find my mouse that I've misplaced before I can actually sign off. So there it is. All right. Now I have a mouse. Now I can actually end the stream. So good night, everybody. It was nice to see you all in the chat. See you next week.